Spelling Story List 8. Mom's Bad Dream. Last week, Mrs. Green had a bad dream. It was actually a nightmare. Mrs. Green always kept her house very neat. Her husband and 3 children helped her, and each of them had a chore to do. But in her nightmare, none of the children wanted to obey her. Although she was not supposed to, Lucy stood up on a high stool trying to reach a jar of sweet honey, which was on top of a shelf. She clumsily made a honey sandwich, but she lost her balance and the jar tipped over. A thick stream of honey dripped over Liz and Tom, who were standing below her. They widely opened their mouths, trying to eat as much honey as they could. Both children got soaked with honey, and they started running everywhere in the house, leaving sticky footprints all over the place. "Yay! I feel so free!" Lucy loudly screamed as she wildly jumped down from the stool and began chasing her brother and sister. Dogzilla chased the children too, while barking and howling behind them. Claudia stared at them from the top of the refrigerator as she ate some chicken she had stolen from a pot on the stove. The worst part of the dream was when the doorbell rang. Mrs. Green ran to the door and asked, "Who is it?" A man's voice answered from the outside. "It's Mr. Barker. I am Mr. Green's boss." "Wait a moment, please," Mrs. Green answered as she turned her horrified face to see the disaster behind her. Then she opened the door just enough to stick her hand out. She nervously said, "I am Mrs. Green. Nice to meet you, Mr. Barker." Mr. Barker shook Mrs. Green's trembling hand, and he said, "May I come in? I have brought an important document that your husband needs to sign." Mrs. Green felt she was going to faint. She experienced a heavy pressure on her chest when she saw Mr. Barker pull his handkerchief out of his suit pocket. He exclaimed, "Your face is all covered with honey. Let me wipe it off." Then he rubbed her nose repeatedly with the moist and wet handkerchief. Suddenly, Mrs. Green opened her eyes. Dogzilla was laying on top of her, chest licking her face. She gently pushed the dog away. "Hello, Dogzilla. I am so happy to see you." "I am glad all of that was just a bad dream," said Mrs. Green. She got up from her bed and walked down to the kitchen. Her family was still sleeping. Everything looked neat and clean. Feeling relieved, she closed her eyes and thanked the Lord for having 3 obedient children, nice pets, and a happy home.